Hello everyone and welcome. Today I wanted to talk a bit about The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2's crazy development, why your expectations should be a lot higher than they are, and why I think it's going to be a much larger game than the original Zelda Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild began development in late 2011, immediately after Skyward Sword was finished, which, depending on how you look at it, Skyward Sword was originally a financial failure, as expectations were to sell even more than Twilight Princess. Aonuma originally stated he would like for all future Zelda titles to take no longer than 3 years, most likely due to Skyward Sword taking 5 or more years to develop. However, Breath of the Wild would go through many setbacks and delays to finally be released in March of 2017, as opposed to the hopeful 2014 estimate, spending a total of almost 5.5 years in development. But not all of it was spent developing Breath of the Wild. A portion of that main Zelda team working on Breath of the Wild also put its development to the side to work on Wind Waker HD. They said it helped them learn the ins and outs of developing for the Nintendo Wii U, as well as the brand new Zelda Wii U engine. They actually tested Wind Waker alongside Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword HD, but felt Wind Waker took advantage of the new engine, lighting, and better hardware. The members of that team wouldn't return to development of Breath of the Wild until Wind Waker HD's release in late 2013. Zelda Wii U, or Breath of the Wild, would go through multiple delays, but Nintendo would eventually state the reason behind each. The first set of delays came from problems with the engine itself, mostly the physics engine. Aonuma stated something along the lines of how sensitive and delicate the engine is. As we all know, almost everything in the game can be interacted with. Getting the physics to behave perfectly took much longer than expected. They would notice a small, tiny glitch, such as the wind blowing, but an apple lying on the ground wouldn't roll along with the wind the way it was supposed to. It would be off by just a tiny bit. So they would adjust it and the apple would be pushed by the wind perfectly. However, they would later notice the exact opposite happening. Suddenly something incredibly heavy like a tree or boulder would be thrown to the other side of Hyrule by the tiniest little breeze, so they would need to go back in and readjust the engine to properly handle it, while making sure the apple still interacted perfectly as they intended. The final delay they had conflicting reports on. Some interviews, they state that Breath of the Wild entering development for the Nintendo Switch alongside the Wii U version didn't affect the release date. However, other interviews contradict this, giving examples such as how hard it was to split the team and start porting a game that is still in the middle of development with lots of bugs that need fixed for the Wii U to a brand new console which required completely different methods of development and optimization, then making the decision to make both versions as equal as possible, despite it meaning that months of development on features and items that made use of the second screen on the Wii U gamepad being scrapped from the game, as well as puzzles, enemies, and basically every single other asset in the game which required any of those features to interact with. So months or even a year or longer's worth of development from a large number of people was just thrown away, so they could begin on new mechanics that could be used equally on both consoles. A few examples of cut content for this specific reason are the dual screens, the flying beetle that used the second screen, and a few other things we can see inside the book, Creating a Champion. Nintendo also wanted both versions of the game to release at the same time, and since the game couldn't release until the Switch released, this meant whether the game was finished or not, it would be delayed until March of 2017 alongside the Nintendo Switch. This was 5.5 years of development, a large portion of which was spent literally coming up with the art style, overworld, story, enemies, and everything else from the ground up. Months or even a year spent coming up with how the engine and the game could make use of everything the Wii U offered, only for all of them to just be thrown away. Some of the teams splitting off to work on Wind Waker HD, returning to Breath of the Wild, multiple other delays thanks to the engine having issues, delays from the teams having to suddenly develop the game for 2 different consoles that required completely different methods of optimization, with each console having completely unique features, one of those consoles being way more powerful than the other, and countless others. Now, with Breath of the Wild 2, Nintendo tells us the game began development as soon as development for Breath of the Wild finished. In fact, the game itself began as just ideas and concepts originally meant to be DLC for the original. And they have also stated most of the DLC, which the sequel began development as, was also left over from ideas and concepts originally meant for the main game. We can see a lot of these examples, such as the dirt bike and other concepts in creating a champion, finally being released as DLC. We can also see a few Breath of the Wild 2 mechanics that came from these same concept images, such as a human form Ganondorf, floating islands in the sky, and much more. Why does this matter? Well, the first game didn't have this advantage. And remember, they originally thought they could do all of this within 3 years, which is almost half the time of its final development cycle. With the sequel, they have this massive boost. All of the reasons that caused delays are no longer an issue. They worked out all of the bugs to finish Breath of the Wild. Yes, there will likely be some new ones, but everything major has already been fixed. They are beginning the sequel with the engine essentially being perfect. Now, they have years of experience with this engine. They have years of experience developing for the Nintendo Switch. They are only developing the game for a single system. All of the assets and main overworld is already done. As for new assets, new story details, new items, weapons, and everything else, we know a portion of new features to the game is already done, as again, the game was based on DLC and concepts that was intended for but went unused in the original. Yes, they would need time to develop new areas, such as the caves we see in the trailers, the islands in the sky, the new cutscenes, new puzzles, dungeons, and everything else that is actually new. But keep in mind, they aren't starting from nothing. They are starting with basically what many thought would be 75% of the game already done, allowing them to develop the sequel similarly to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, which Nintendo themselves also made the comparison between Breath of the Wild 2 and Majora's Mask, also noting that it would be a much darker game. So why or how could a sequel with this much already completely finished at the start of development be in development for just as long as the original, if not longer? And again, Nintendo originally thought they could finish and release the original Breath of the Wild in just 3 years before all of the delays. If they thought they could make all of Breath of the Wild from the ground up in just 3 years, wouldn't you expect a sequel with all of these advantages and a head start to take a lot less? Well, this is where the exciting news comes in. With Breath of the Wild, Nintendo really pushed the Wii U to its limits and ported that version to the Nintendo Switch alongside each other, trying to keep them as equal as possible. Now, they can perfectly optimize this newer version of the engine to specifically work with the Nintendo Switch. A quick example, if we look at the new Doom and its sequel running on the Nintendo Switch, between the first and second game, the sequel to Doom further optimized its engine to run on the Nintendo Switch, which doesn't necessarily double performance, but there is an incredible difference between frame rates, resolution, quality of textures, and everything else. Again, using the same engine, just better optimized. Now, they can perfectly optimize this newer version of the engine to specifically work with the Switch. Going by the new trailers, we can already tell the game easily looks better than the original, but that's just a bonus. The game already looked great. The really exciting part is thinking, even if we do include slowdowns or development temporarily shutting down for the pandemic, the thought of Nintendo spending all of this extra time to add on to the world of Hyrule and everything else in the original game that already exists, our brains just go crazy trying to think of all of the new, unique things Nintendo could be adding. We have already seen we will be exploring new caves underground and new islands in the sky, with them stating the sequel began as DLC or cut content for the original. We know how much fans and Nintendo love the idea of a second world, underwater exploration, and hopefully bringing traditional dungeons back. Covering Hyrule with new or rebuilt villages, like we've seen in past memories, as well as Hyrule Warriors, Age of Clams. New characters, new quests. We already have interviews where Aonuma has stated he would love to continue building onto the already existing Hyrule, which was the main reason behind the DLC called The Hero's Path, which lets you and Nintendo know exactly which areas people avoid or are less traveled, so that Nintendo can go back in and add new stuff to make those areas a lot more fun by adding in new little stuff or completely changing the area, saying that he would love for the game to have a changing dynamic overworld, which I feel is where the concept of Tarrey Town and creating Link's house came in. Honestly, we don't know everything Nintendo could be adding. These ideas are just based on past interviews and statements from Nintendo, but I would love to hear any ideas that you may have. If they could create all of Breath of the Wild in those 5.5 years, despite all of the setbacks and teams splitting up, working on separate games, and having no experience with either the engine or completely different consoles. If we take that same amount of time and just imagine what Nintendo could add to everything that already exists with the experience they already have, the engine already being perfected, and hopefully none of the original setbacks, the sequel to Breath of the Wild could end up having not just the underground caves and sky above Hyrule to explore, but honestly, it could very easily have an entire second world that is the same size, if not even bigger than Hyrule. Yes, that does sound like a fanboy asking for way too much, but again, with the time they have had, it honestly isn't even a slight stretch or exaggeration for them to have done this. And with as successful as Breath of the Wild, its 2 DLC packs, and even the spin-off Age of Clams all were, Nintendo would have absolutely no hesitation on heavily increasing the budget for the sequel. Remember, Breath of the Wild came about after Skyward Sword was a financial failure. Breath of the Wild 2 is coming after the game is 3 to 4 times more popular than it ever was, making more money in a single year than the rest of the series had in possibly a decade. So with all of this information, what would you love to see from Breath of the Wild 2?